Story 1.
I was 27 years old when that happened. It was July 2019, a period in my life marked by many uncertainties. I worked as a freelance designer in Portland, Oregon, living alone in a small apartment in the Pearl District. My days were a mix of projects for technology startups, artisanal coffee, and a lot of solitude. At the time, I was going through a rough patch. I had ended a 3-year relationship with a guy I met at design school and was trying to get back on my feet, finding refuge in work and long evening walks to clear my head. Forest Park, one of the largest urban parks in the United States, had become my favorite place to unwind. He knew every trail, every curve of that immense place. It was a park with more than 5,000 hectares, with dense vegetation and practically wild areas. At night, it almost looked like a horror movie set, with long shadows and eerie sounds coming from deep in the forest. I loved this atmosphere. I was always walking with my AirPods headphones, listening to podcasts about design or indie music, trying to disconnect from the thoughts that haunted me after the breakup. On that specific night, I had no idea what awaited me in that place that I thought was so familiar. That night, the sky was particularly dark. Dense clouds covered the moon, leaving the park in almost complete darkness. My steps broke the silence on the damp gravel of the path, and the cold July air made me hug my army green sweatshirt tighter. I remember I had just passed a bend in the road when I noticed something different. A strange silence began to form, different from the usual night noise of the forest. There was no chirping of crickets, nor the distant hooting of an owl. It was as if all natural life had been sucked out of that place in a matter of seconds. That's when I saw him, right there, among the twisted trunks of centuries-old oak trees. A huge black dog sat. It wasn't just any dog. He had a different, almost unreal bearing. His eyes reflected a strange luminosity, as if they had their own light even in the darkness. They were eyes fixed on me, penetrating, that seemed to pierce my soul. He didn't bark, he didn't move. He was perfectly still, like a living statue. My heart started to beat faster, and a chilling sensation ran down my spine. Something about that animal wasn't right, something that went far beyond just being a lost dog in the park. My first impulse was curiosity. Something about that animal intrigued me deeply. I took a step forward, thinking about getting closer, but at the exact moment my foot touched the ground, the dog stood up. It was gigantic, bigger than any race I had ever seen before. His movements were fluid, almost feline, completely different from the clumsy gait of a normal dog. He didn't run away. He simply walked away a few meters, always looking at me with those eyes that seemed to burn in the middle of the darkness. I realized then that it wasn't an escape, it was an invitation. A silent invitation to follow him. Something inside me told me to go back, to ignore that strange animal and continue my usual walk. But an inexplicable force pulled me forward. My headphones were now muted. The music had stopped without me noticing. The only sound was my panting and the soft footsteps of the black dog that continued to watch me, always a few meters away. He clearly wanted me to follow him, but why? My every step seemed to be calculated, as if we were dancing a strange nocturnal choreography in the middle of that immense forest. The once familiar park now seemed like a completely different place. As I progressed, I realized I was being led to a part of the park I had never explored before. The trees became denser, the branches more twisted, creating a dark green tunnel that seemed to have no end. The dog was still in front of me, always at a calculated distance, close enough for me to follow, but far enough to maintain an air of mystery. My sneakers crunched on dry leaves, making a crunching noise that echoed strangely through the trees. The air was thicker, with a damp smell of earth and moss that made me feel a sense of gradual suffocation. Suddenly, I noticed something strange. There were no traces of the dog on the floor, even stepping on dry leaves and wet earth. No marks, no footprints. It was as if he were floating, like a living shadow moving between the trees. My heart started to beat faster. A mixture of fear and curiosity consumed me. The animal's eyes were still fixed on me, now with an almost hypnotic glow. It wasn't an animal look. It was something deeper, almost intelligent. I realized that I was not dealing with an ordinary dog, but something completely different, something that defied any rational explanation I could find. I don't know how long I followed that strange animal. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to not exist in that place. The trees around me formed an increasingly dense green maze, and I was sure I was already far off the park's traditional paths. The black dog continued its silent march, always guiding me, always making me follow. I began to feel a cold sweat running down the back of my neck, mixing with the humidity of the night. My thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and curiosity, struggling to understand what was happening and why this animal seemed so interested in me. Then, without warning, the dog stopped. It was right in front of a small clearing, almost hidden among the twisted trunks. The moon, which was previously hidden, now shed a silvery light over that specific space. The animal turned to me for the first time, not just with its gaze, but with its entire body. His eyes still glowed with that otherworldly intensity, but now there was something more, almost like an invitation, a silent challenge. I knew I needed to decide, continue or return. My mind rationalized that I should turn around, but my feet seemed to have a life of their own, slowly pulling me towards that mysterious clearing. In the center of that clearing, something caught my attention immediately. There was a strange object on the floor. It seemed to be some kind of ancient medallion, covered in moss and with symbols on it that I had never seen before. It was round, made of a metal that looked darker than bronze, with inscriptions that looked like they had been engraved centuries ago. The dog continued to stand still, watching me with an intensity that completely froze me. I knew I should keep my distance, that something wasn't right, but my curiosity was stronger than any survival instinct. My hand, trembling, began to reach almost involuntarily towards that mysterious object. Just when my fingers were about to touch the locket, the dog let out a low howl, completely unlike any sound I had ever heard. It wasn't a wolf's or a dog's howl. It was something between a human groan and a guttural sound that made me freeze. The sound seemed to carry a message, a warning that I couldn't decipher. The temperature around me dropped drastically, and I noticed that my breath had become visible, forming small clouds of vapor in the frigid air. The symbols on the locket seemed to come to life, almost moving in the silver moonlight. It was as if the entire place was frozen in time, awaiting my next action. I can't explain what happened in the next few seconds. My fingers finally touched the medallion and an electric shock ran through my entire body. It was as if thousands of memories that weren't mine invaded my mind in a single instant. Fragmented visions of completely different people, places, times flashed through my head at breakneck speed. The dog was still there, now sitting, watching me with an almost compassionate expression. I felt that that animal knew exactly what was happening, that he was just a guardian, a conductor of that inexplicable moment he was living. When I came to, the locket was gone. The black dog too. It was in exactly the same place in the park where I had found it for the first time, as if nothing had happened. My hoodie was covered in dirt and dry leaves. My sneakers were dirty, but I couldn't remember how I got there. I looked around, completely lost, trying to understand if all of this had been real or just a very vivid dream. The only thing I was certain of was that something profound had changed within me that night, something I could never fully explain. Over the next few weeks, I tried to understand what had happened. I researched local legends, looked for experts in paranormal phenomena, talked to friends who knew the history of Forest Park. No one could explain that experience. The closest I came to an answer was an old forest ranger who told me, after much conversation, that there are old stories about a guardian dog that appears to some people at specific times. He didn't give any more details, just a meaningful look that made me understand that there were secrets that couldn't be revealed completely. Today, years later, I still don't understand that night, but something changed in me, That experience made me a different person, more attentive to the mysteries that exist beyond what we can see or understand. The locket, the visions, the dog, it all felt like it was part of something bigger than me. Sometimes when I go back to that park, I get goosebumps. I look for that animal, that clearing, but I never find them again. Maybe it was just a dream. Maybe it was something much deeper. The only certainty I have is that that night, something chose me. And to this day, I don't know exactly why. Story 2. I've lived in a quiet suburban area of Minneapolis for almost 8 years, and nothing strange had ever happened around here until last fall. It was in October, when temperatures began to drop and tree leaves were already covering the sidewalks. At first, I thought it was just another one of the neighborhood dogs that sometimes escapes from the backyard. You know, there's always 1 or 2 golden retrievers walking around alone that the owner needs to pick up. But this dog was different. He appeared to be a large German shepherd, from what I could see from a distance, but whenever I tried to get closer to see if he had a leash or try to help, he would just disappear. It wasn't like he ran or hid. One moment he was there, standing watching me from the corner of Marshall Avenue, and the next second he was gone, as if he had never been there. The first few times this happened, I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was very fast, or knew some shortcut between the houses that I hadn't noticed. I even posted in the neighborhood Facebook group asking if anyone had lost a German shepherd, but no one responded. What really started to bother me was the frequency. It was always the same time, around 6:30 in the afternoon, when I returned from work. And he was always in the same place, standing on the same corner, looking at me with those eyes. I don't know how to explain it, but there was something in his eyes that didn't seem normal. It wasn't that friendly look that we are used to seeing in dogs. It was like he was studying me. After about 2 weeks of seeing that dog, I started changing my route home. I know it may sound a little paranoid, but there was something about the whole situation that was making me increasingly anxious. The worst thing is that even changing the route, even arriving at different times, that damn dog always found a way to appear at some point on my route. Once, I swear I saw him on 2 different corners less than a minute apart, which is impossible because they were parallel streets and there wouldn't have been time for him to run that fast. At that time, I felt my stomach sink, you know? That horrible feeling that there is something very wrong happening, but you can't explain exactly what. The situation started to affect my sleep and routine. I installed security cameras around the house, started double-checking that all the doors and windows were locked before going to sleep. My girlfriend Sarah thought I was exaggerating. She said it was just a stray dog and that I was letting my anxiety take over. But she hadn't seen what I saw. He hadn't noticed how the street lights seemed to get dimmer when he was around, or how the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. One time, I tried to take a photo of him with my cell phone to prove I wasn't going crazy. When I looked at the photo later, there was just a dark, blurry spot where he should have been, as if the camera couldn't focus on him properly. It was on a Thursday night that things really started to get out of control. Sarah had gone to visit her parents in Wisconsin, and I was home alone watching TV in the living room. It was around 11 p.m. when I heard the first bark. It wasn't like a normal dog bark, it was lower pitched, deeper, like it was coming from something much bigger, and it came from my backyard. I turned off the TV immediately and lay completely still on the couch, my heart beating so hard I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. The security cameras I had installed started to interfere all at the same time. The screens were full of those black and white streaks, like in the old days when the TV lost the signal. I grabbed my cell phone and the flashlight that I always leave in the coffee table drawer, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold them properly. The temperature inside the house seemed to have suddenly dropped by 10 degrees. Through the living room window that overlooks the backyard, I could see that the light from the street lamp, which normally illuminates the lawn well, was much weaker than normal, creating strange shadows in the corners. The barking came again, this time seeming even closer to the back door. It wasn't just the sound that was wrong. There was a strange quality to it, like it was distorted, or like more than one thing was barking at the same time, but at different frequencies. It was the kind of sound you feel in your spine before you even process it with your ears. With my heart in my throat, I went to the kitchen to look out the window that looks directly into the backyard. My legs were so wobbly that I had to lean on the walls while walking. The sound of my footsteps on the wooden floor seemed absurdly loud in the silence of the house. When I got to the kitchen, I noticed that the temperature had dropped even further. I could see my own breath forming little clouds in the air. The window was completely fogged up, as if it had been frozen from the inside. I ran my hand over it to try to clean it and be able to see outside, and at that moment I felt all the hairs on my body stand up. The surface of the glass was hot, despite the intense cold in the room. It was when I tried to turn on the flashlight that I realized it didn't work, even though I had recently changed the batteries. My cell phone was also dead, despite having 80% battery minutes before. Panic started to take over me when I heard a scratching sound coming from the back door. It wasn't like a normal dog scratching to get in. It was much louder, like giant claws were tearing through the wood. The kitchen light started blinking frantically, and in one of the flashes, I swear I saw a huge shadow pass by the window. It was much larger than any dog I had ever seen, and for a split second, it seemed to me like it had more than one head. At that moment, all my instincts were screaming at me to run away, but my body simply wouldn't move. It was as if something was holding me in place, forcing me to face the situation. The air had become so thick that it was difficult to breathe, and a strong smell of sulfur permeated the entire kitchen. The scratching on the door became more violent, and I could hear the wood starting to crack. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were old claw marks all over the door, as if that thing had been there before, maybe several times, without me ever noticing. Some marks looked months old, others weeks old, forming layers and layers of scratches that only now, under the blinking light, could I see clearly. Then suddenly, everything stopped. The lights stopped flashing, the scratching stopped, and the silence that followed was perhaps even more frightening than everything else. Slowly, I regained control of my body and, gathering all the courage I could muster, I approached the door. The claw marks were still there, deep and undeniable in the wood. But there was something different now. They seemed to form a pattern, almost like letters. It took me a few seconds to process, but when I finally understood what was written, my stomach dropped. There, clearly marked on the wood of my door, was "Always watching you." The most disturbing, the lyrics seemed to have been written over weeks, one by one, on different occasions, like a message that was slowly being composed, right under my nose. After that night, the dog never appeared in the same way as before. The marks on the door are the only physical proof I have that all of this really happened. Sarah came back the next day and, of course, thought I had made it all up because I was lonely and stressed. The security cameras recorded absolutely nothing. They only showed static for the entire hour that everything happened. I tried looking for similar cases on the internet and found some stories about spectral dogs on obscure forums, but nothing that explained exactly what happened to me. I even went to a psychiatrist thinking I might be having some kind of episode, but all the tests came back normal. The only thing that has changed is that now, every time I hear a dog barking at night, my entire body freezes. The strangest thing is that, a few weeks later, when I finally found the courage to change the back door, I discovered something that haunts me to this day. When removing the old door, I found claw marks on the other side too, but these were different. They looked older, as if they had been there when I moved into the house. I went to check old photos I had of the house, from when I made the purchase, and in one of them you can see, right in the corner of the yard, a dark shape that looks a lot like a large dog. This photo is from 8 years ago. Since then, I've had the constant feeling that that thing never really went away, it just stopped showing itself. Sometimes when I'm home alone, I still feel like something is watching me through the windows. And on the quietest nights, when the wind blows a specific way, I could swear I hear that same distorted bark, coming from somewhere very close.
Story
Story 3. I still can't sleep well after what happened last week here in Cedar Rapids. I've lived alone since I moved to Iowa 8 months ago for work, in an old but well-maintained house at the end of Riverside Drive. It's a quiet neighborhood, one of those typical of a small American town, where everyone knows everyone and leaves the doors unlocked. I always liked the peace here, especially at night when I took Max, my golden retriever, to pee in the yard before going to sleep. I had never felt scared or anything strange until that Thursday. I know a lot of people won't believe what I'm going to tell you, but I need to share this with someone. I'm sure I wasn't imagining things, and honestly, I still shudder just remembering it. It was around 11 p.m. when I went out with Max like I always did. The night was darker than usual because the moon was covered and some streetlights near the house were burnt out, something that had never bothered me before. I was distracted using my cell phone while Max was sniffing around the garden, when I noticed that he started to act different. He was very quiet, frozen, staring at the back fence that divides my yard with a somewhat abandoned area. I thought it was strange because he never did that. When I looked in the direction he was focused on, my blood instantly ran cold. There were two glowing eyes staring at me through the cracks in the wooden fence. They weren't the eyes of a cat or any other animal I've ever seen. They were too big and had a greenish glow that seemed to emit its own light. The most disturbing thing is that they were the height of an adult person. I stood frozen for a few seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. Max started to growl softly, something he never did. He's one of those dogs that loves everyone and only knows how to wag his tail. My hands started to shake, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. I decided to gather my courage and took 2 steps towards the fence, holding tight to Max's collar. That's when the eyes just disappeared. It wasn't as if the person had ducked or moved to the side. They literally disappeared in the blink of an eye. The worst thing is that even without seeing anything else, I could feel, with all the certainty in the world, that I was still being watched. It was like something was there, studying me, just waiting. I pulled Max back into the house as quickly as I could, almost tripping on the back porch steps. I locked all the doors and closed all the curtains, my heart beating so hard it felt like it was going to explode. I tried to calm myself down by saying it was just my head being tired after a long day at work. But Max was still restless, pacing from side to side and staring at the window that overlooked the backyard. I turned on the TV to try to make noise and distract myself, but I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes. I sent a message to my friend Sarah to tell her what had happened, but she said I must have been exaggerating and that it was probably just a homeless person passing by behind the fence. I really wanted to believe that, but something inside me knew it wasn't that simple. After about 2 hours of trying to calm down, I decided to try to sleep. I took Max to my room, something I never let him do before, and closed the door. I lay in bed but kept looking at the clock every 5 minutes, tossing and turning restlessly. Around 3 a.m., Max jumped out of bed and started growling again, staring at the bedroom window. My heart sank when I realized the curtains were partially open. I gathered courage and looked in the direction Max was focused. My whole body froze. There were those same eyes again, but this time right next to my second-story window. How was this possible? There were no trees near the window, nor anywhere anyone could climb or stand. I was in shock, trying to understand how something could be watching me there. In a quick movement, I grabbed my cell phone to try to take a photo, but when I pointed the camera, the eyes were gone again. I ran to the switch and turned on all the lights in the room, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold the phone. I looked out the window and there was nothing outside, no footprints, no marks, no sign that anything had been there. The yard was completely empty and silent, but that horrible feeling of being watched continued. It was as if any dark corner of the room could hide those eyes. Max kept growling softly and I started to notice a strange smell in the air, kind of metallic, as if it were rust mixed with something rotten. I couldn't bear to stay in that room for another minute. I grabbed my bag, car keys, and ran down the stairs with Max. I didn't even care that I was in my pajamas. I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. As I was unlocking the front door, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen, as if something was scratching the window glass. Max started barking desperately, and I swear I felt cold breath on the back of my neck. I didn't look back. I just opened the door and ran to the car as if my life depended on it. My hands were shaking so much that I dropped the keys twice before I could start the car. When I finally drove off, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw those eyes staring at me from my bedroom window. Upstairs that I drove aimlessly for almost an hour, passing the same places several times, just to make sure nothing was following me. I ended up stopping in the parking lot of a 24-hour Walmart, where I stayed until dawn with Max in the back seat. Every shadow, every movement I saw out of the corner of my eye made me shiver. The worst part is that strange smell of rust and rot still seemed to be in the car, even with all the windows open. I checked my phone obsessively, as if I might receive some magical explanation of what was happening. I texted Sarah again, but she didn't respond. She was probably asleep. I thought about calling the police, but what was I going to say? That there were eyes chasing me? They would think I was crazy or on drugs. When the sun started to rise, I found the courage to go home. I thought that in daylight everything would seem less scary, that I would be able to find some logical explanation for it all. But as soon as I parked in front of the house, I noticed something was different. All the curtains I had closed before leaving were open, and the back door to the backyard was wide open. I stood in the car for about 10 minutes, breathing deeply and trying to convince myself to get in. Max, who was always super excitable, was quiet and huddled in the back seat, as if he was afraid to get out. I called my neighbor, Mr. Thompson, asking if he had seen anything strange during the night. He said he hadn't noticed anything, but mentioned that his dog had been barking nonstop at around 3 a.m. With wobbly legs, I finally entered the house. The smell of rust and rot was much stronger inside. I checked room by room with Max glued to my legs. Nothing seemed to have been disturbed or stolen, but there was something disturbing. On each window in the house, on the inside of the glass, there were scratch marks forming circular patterns, as if something had tried to draw eyes. In my room, the situation was even worse. Scratch marks covered practically the entire window, and on the vanity mirror there was a handprint made with something that looked like dried mud mixed with a dark liquid. But what scared me most was finding, on top of my bed, a piece of the back fence, exactly where I had seen the eyes for the first time. I couldn't bear to stay in that house for another second. I threw some clothes in a suitcase, grabbed Max's food, and went straight to a hotel near the airport. I spent the whole day trying to find some rational explanation for all that, searching the internet for similar cases in the region, but I didn't find anything similar. I sent a message to Sarah about the latest developments, and this time, she seemed to take it seriously. He said he was going to come by the house after work to take a look. A few hours later, she sent me photos of what she had found. All the marks were gone. The windows were clean, without any scratches. The mirror was normal, and there was no piece of fence in my room. If it weren't for the strange smell that still lingered on my clothes, I could have sworn I had imagined it all. It's been a week and I still haven't come home. I quit my job and am temporarily living with my parents in Minnesota. Max still acts strange sometimes, especially at night, when he stares at the windows as if he expects to see something. The worst thing is, even here, miles away from Cedar Rapids, I still feel like I'm being watched. Sometimes, when I'm almost asleep, I feel like I see that greenish glow reflected in some dark corner of the room. I don't know what that thing was, and honestly, I don't want to know. I just know that I will never be able to look at a fence the same way again, and that I will always wonder if those eyes are still looking for me somewhere.